Folks, now we're going to go, and Jikku John is already at the microphone. He's been in on the conversation with Mario on voluntary leaving in unemployment claims. Elsa, welcome back to the to the table. We only have four microphones here today, and maybe as we get more followers, we can get more microphones.
There you go. It's on you, listeners.
But Jikku is going to talk about Americans with the Disabilities Act, that we all have a role to play, I think, as employers in looking for our workforce when it comes down to it. What we always kind of continue to say, everybody in Texas that wants a job can find a job, and we're here to help you do that. A lot of our initiatives revolve around vocational rehabilitation here at the Texas Workforce Commission. We've got a lot of people hard at work helping people find jobs. When it comes to employers, Jikku, what are the big things about the American with Disabilities Act?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner. Now, just to start off, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that was a law that was passed in 1990 and went into effect in 1992. Now, the main purpose of the ADA is to protect people with disabilities from discrimination in employment programs, activities offered by state, local governments, for accessing goods, services, places like restaurants, things like that. Now, today we're going to talk specifically about Title I of the ADA. Now, what Title I does, it prohibits discrimination in employment, requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities. Now, as far as the ADA is concerned, now, I'm sure you guys are aware of the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. Now, the FMLA applies to your business if you have 50 employees or more. That's 50 employees or more. Now, the ADA is different. So, under the ADA, if you have 15 employees or more, then you fall under the protection of what is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, like I said before, as an employer, you have to reasonably accommodate an individual if they have a disability, right? So who are the employees that gets counted? Part-time employees, they get counted. Owners, operators, they get counted. Now, the only, I guess, individuals that don't get counted for that 15-member calculation, independent contractors, if they're truly an independent contractor. I know Mario talked about that in the previous podcast.
That's right, yeah.
Now, that being said, like I said before, if it's 15 employees, if an employer has 15 employees during this year or the previous calendar year, you have to abide with the ADA. And a lot of employers don't know about the ADA, right? They think, I can just fire an employee. They don't really go through that interactive process, trying to work with that employee to find an accommodation for them. You can't do that. Under the ADA, you need to make sure that you reasonably accommodate. Yeah.
So does that mean? Does that mean, okay, a small business with 15 workers, if any of those, are we talking about if one of our employees needs an accommodation, has a disability? And we'll get into the definitions of that too. But or are we talking about just having anybody with a disability that may come into your business?
Commissioner, that is an excellent question. Now, as far as the ADA is concerned, the ADA kicks in the moment that a job applicant turns in their application for a job. From that moment itself, as the employer, you need to make sure that you reasonably accommodate. So, for example, at a job interview, if an interviewee comes and lets you know as the employer that they need an accommodation, maybe as an employer, you're providing a job-related test during the interview. Now, as an employer, you cannot be like, oh, you know what, you're not an employee at this point, so I don't need to accommodate. You cannot be doing that. As an employer, you still need to make sure that you reasonably accommodate. So, like I said before, from the moment that a job applicant turns in their application for the job, as an employer, you need to make sure that you reasonably accommodate. Now, real quickly, from a very broad perspective, under the ADA, you cannot treat someone worse because they have a disability. So as an employer, what are you trying to do? What you're trying to do is, sometimes you may need to treat an employee better because they have a disability, right? So the reason why you do that is you want employees to be at the same level. So yes, it could be the case that you're treating an employee with a disability better, but at the end of the day, you're making sure that they are on the same scale. They are on par with other employees without disabilities. You cannot be treating an employee worse due to their disability.
And can you give an example of a creative, reasonable accommodation that you've heard from an
Yeah.
employer?
So employers often contact us regarding the ADA, and I don't know if it's creative, but telework is something that we often tell employers. If you have an employee and they're not able to be at the workplace because of whatever reason it may be, maybe they can work remotely. That is something that a lot of employers, they do offer that opportunity to employees, just because they may not be able to be at the workplace, but they can still do the job and still do the job well when they are working remotely from another location. Yeah.
Bonnie,
Yes.
I have a little story. It's not so creative, but this is an example of an employer who called us. It was years ago, but it stayed with me because not all accommodations have to be complicated. And so the employer called and had an employee, long-term employee, good employee, and she had a weight issue. And I'm going to go as far as to say that the employer said she was medically obese and she was having trouble getting around. And she was having trouble fitting in her work chair. Okay, and it sounds like almost like trivial to some extent to some people that have different kinds of disabilities. But she could not perform the job when she could not. She needed to sit. She could not stand. And she could not sit in the rolling chairs that they had. And so the employer's like, I don't know what to do. I don't want to get rid of her, but we have this issue and it's a medical issue. And so I said, well, have you considered, a chair without arms? And he's like, I can do that. I don't need like medical equipment or get a wheelchair or something. And I said, no. He's like, oh. He's like, I can do that. And so he just switched to a chair without arms where she was having trouble fitting. And it's like, great, thank you so much. So that's a reasonable accommodation to have somebody continue to be able to work and sit and move around without, a lot of expense or medical equipment, difficulty or anything like that.
Does it have to be agreeable to the person when it comes down to it? Just thinking about like the telework, that is a way to address an accommodation. But if the person feels like I want to be with you guys, I want to be here having good times in the podcast room. Where if I wasn't able to come to work, I would feel being left out. But does that take place? Is there is that agreeable to you as an accommodation? And they say yes or no.
Yeah, absolutely, Commissioner. So that's a great segue into what I was going to talk about.
I guess document it to go on our
Yeah. So
theme.
So what you need to do is you need to engage in what is called the interactive process. So if an employee comes to you and tells you, I need an accommodation, and that accommodation could be telework.
Yeah.
Now, in that interactive process, maybe for the employer or for that employee, telework may not work. That may not be the best accommodation that's available. So under the interactive process, fancy way of saying you need to talk to your employee, right? So as far as, the interactive process is concerned, you get their opinion on maybe, telework is not something that we can do as an employer, but here are other options. So you need to go through that process to figure out what is going to be something that works best for the employer and the employee. Now, you don't need to provide the accommodation that the specific accommodation that the employee wants. But again, once you go through that interactive process and you document it, you need to make sure that you properly document all the interactions that you have with that employee regarding these reasonable accommodations, so that later down the line, if an ADA lawsuit does arise, it does not come back and show that you never tried to work with this employee as far as possible accommodations. So it doesn't have to be the specific accommodations that they requested, Commissioner, but you still need to show that you work with them to the maximum extent possible.
Yeah, and so to just further clarify, the preferred accommodation from the employee does not need to be, like Jikku was saying, the one that the employer provides. The employer needs to provide a reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
And sometimes that does not necessarily equal the preferred accommodation that the employee has. Needs to be reasonable.
Understood. Before we get too much into it, did we talk about the definition of a disability?
A disability, Commissioner, is a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So a lot of employers think that it's just a physical impairment that is looked at, but no, it's a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And what is major life activities? It could be something as simple as, standing or sitting or walking. All that could be a major life activity. So if it significantly affects a major life activity, then as an employer, you need to reasonably accommodate.
Does a follow-up question? Does it need to be medically documented?
So it doesn't have to be medically documented, Commissioner. So as far as an accommodation need, it can be just in plain English. The employee can come and let you know what, I have a pain in my back. And what I need is I want as an accommodation, if it's possible, I would like a standing desk to do the job. So it doesn't have to be medically documented. But that being said, I want to make sure that I emphasize what I tell employers is, you know what, if an employee comes to you and they have a reasonable accommodation request, then I would have them talk to their provider. And once they talk to the provider, let them know, you know what, you need an accommodation, tell your provider to, contact or through the employee, let us know what the accommodation you need may be. So then you can go through that interactive process to figure out what will be the best accommodation for them. Yeah.
Yeah, like what am I trying to say? We recommend, for example, if it is a physical issue, and the diagnosis is never the employer's business.
Sure. Yeah.
The job is always
Good point.
the employer's business.
Yeah.
So you don't need to know whether or not I can do XYZ because I have diabetes or I'm going through cancer treatment.
Sure.
That's not the employer's business. If the employee wants to share, that's a whole other thing. But the duties of the job is always the employer's business. And someone says, hey, I can't lift or I do need a standing desk. And you do want medical documentation to substantiate whatever that is because of your medical, your file, your employee file. We recommend take the job description that lists the physical aspects of the job. Needs to lift 10 pounds, needs to be on their feet 8 hours, or needs to be sitting down 8 hours, with a 1 hour lunch break. Have the employee take that to the doctor and it's like, hey, take that to your doctor and ask the doctor, can I perform these job duties? And if not, what restriction or limitation or what accommodation do I need? What change do I need? Okay, you can't be sitting for 8 hours at a time.
Yeah.
You're going to need to sit for 2 hours and then have a 1 hour stand-up break or whatever. Once you get that from the doctor, now the employer knows, oh, this is what I need to accommodate. And so that really helps with that interactive process.
Okay. Thank you for that.
What about the misconceptions, especially from the employer standpoint? I think one example was they think if you have to accommodate, it's going to be expensive. Can you give some examples of that?
Bonnie, that's a great question that you just presented. Now, one of the main misconception, and I think you hit the nail on the head here, is that reasonable accommodations under the ADA, it can be unduly expensive. It could be extremely costly to employers. Employers think that it can be extremely costly to provide reasonable accommodations to their employees. Now, the matter of the fact is that is just not true. There is a fact sheet from the DOL which pretty much states that the majority of accommodations cost absolutely nothing at all to employers. I think the percentage is like 56 to 58% of accommodations, they cost nothing at all. And the rest of the accommodations cost about $500 or less. So although employers think that it can be extremely burdensome, extremely costly to provide an accommodation, for the most part, that is just not true.
And kind of a follow-up question, Jikku, you mentioned the 15 employers or more. What can small businesses do to support employees with disabilities, even if they aren't required to comply with the ADA?
Yeah, so Bonnie, even if they're not required to comply with the ADA, and we have a lot of employers that call our office asking that exact thing. As an employer, I don't have 15 employees or more. What do I do? Now, at the end of the day, it's up to the employer how you handle that situation. It's to the best interest of the company. Now, that being said, although you don't have to accommodate, it's always better to accommodate the employee to the maximum extent possible, even if you don't meet that 15 employee mark. Now, that could be for employee retention, that could be for other reasons, just good employee morale at the employer's place of business. Now, again, like I said before, if you're an employer that doesn't have 15 employees, then you can handle it any way you want as far as a job separation, separation, how it goes. Now, let the commission know if an unemployment claim comes that the job separation was due to the medically verifiable illness of that person, and you should be able to get, if you let the commission know about that, chargeback protection. And I know Elsa may talk about it in one of the podcasts that come down the line. But nonetheless, it's up to the employer on how you handle that situation. Now, that being said, like I said before, Bonnie, it's always good to reasonably accommodate.
What about what if the accommodation has anything to do with more time off, and how does an employer navigate something like that?
Yeah, so leave can be a reasonable accommodation, Commissioner. So under the FMLA, you have 12 weeks of unpaid leave, right? That is required.
Okay.
If that employee meets the eligibility requirements. Now, under the ADA, there is not a definite time frame as far as that leave is concerned, right? There is no 12-week limit. It's kind of vague as far as what that leave time may be.
So in other words, there is no upper limit on how much leave may be required as reasonable. No upper limit.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that being said, if an employee falls out of the protection of the FMLA, then they can still be under the protection of the ADA. And like Elsa just said, there is no upper limit as far as how much leave is required. But that being said, if that leave is, too long, then it can be an undue hardship for the business.
Right.
Right. And at that point, that may be an argument that the employer can make. Right, it is costing extensive amount of money to have that employee be out on the leave because it takes other resources out of the company. So that could be something that the employer can show. But as far as leave is concerned, yes, it is a reasonable accommodation. But at the end of the day, if it is too long, then it's just a measurement that the employer needs to do in the best interest of the company.
All right. So there is resource for the employer to have a balance.
Yeah.
And it reasonable. I think we're highlighting reasonable. What about as far as when we're talking about like undue hardship? Is that on the side of the employee that we're like if an employer is asking an employee to have some activity that they're not able to do? Is that where the definition of undue hardship comes in?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner. Now, as far as undue hardship is concerned, it is the definition is an extreme financial difficulty expense that is measured on a case-by-case basis. Now, as far as undue hardship is concerned, the burden is always going to be on the employer. It's not the employee's burden, it's the employer's burden to show undue hardship. Now, a lot of employers, they think that generalized assertions, generalized conclusions by the employer, that's going to be enough to show undue hardship. And that's not the case. As an employer, to show undue hardship, you need to go through the process. You need to show that you did go through the interactive process. You tried to work with that employee to your absolute best to make sure that you try to reasonably accommodate them as far as their disability is concerned. As an employer, like I said, you need to go through the process. You need to make sure that you reasonably accommodate. And at the end, after that, if it's the case that it is extremely costly, it is a financial burden, then you can show undue hardship. Then you have a better case to show undue hardship.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up the 3 good, excellent topics over the last couple of series of our last few episodes, folks. And again, what we want to do is hopefully you have an interest in learning more to not only protect yourself, but to also, give your employees and your workforce, you treat them right. They'll treat you right. Customer service is always good for business. But yeah, these topics and more are discussed at our Texas Conference for Employers. You can just Google search that Texas Conference for Employers. It'll take you to, I shouldn't say Google. You can search for it. Use whatever search engine you want. Really, it is. But yeah, look it up and find any dates that are coming up. I know Amarillo is going to be on the horizon.
Yes,
we've got Amarillo
and Victoria.
We've got a small, large and small metropolitan areas are 2-day. We have a 2-day conference in Dallas.
Houston.
That was last year. Yeah, we had it last year in Dallas. Oh, good. Yeah. You can go, we're going to go see our folks in Houston. But also, we, again, 24/7. You can call us 24/7, leave a message.
Leave a message. Yep.
Emails are always open.
Yes.
But yeah, our attorneys work real hard to get you the answers you need and get a good response. So hopefully you found this past couple of episodes helpful, Bonnie.
Yes, my cup runneth over. Employment law
Bonnie's cup has
information.
exploded.
I have, I used to work with these guys
Yeah.
for 8 years, and I just always learn something new. So I just appreciate the time. I mean, y'all are my celebrities. I mean, y'all, the knowledge, is out the wazoo in this room. So I just feel
You're
very
still-
privileged.
You're
to
still
be
working here.
I
Bonnie.
know. I'm still on the
Just let
clock
you
here.
know.
I don't know how this happened.
like I
Just ain't
try to get
paying
away.
you.
I can't get away from
That's
you guys.
right. I keep getting out.
No,
They
but
keep bringing me back
really
in.
did.
I appreciate this time, and again, great podcast, and y'all make
Yeah.
our jobs easy.
Thank you all very much. And at some point, we're going to bring Tommy Simmons on for his topic to be named later. I'm not going to say venture out what it would be. But again, tell your friends, the people that you care about that have businesses or that are employing your fellow Texans. Tell them about this podcast. It's a great, like I said, we have a great resource to provide you. Tell them to follow, tell your friends, and help us gain our followship. And like I said, then we'll be able to add more microphones when the topics just start overflowing and things like that too. So, but thanks everybody. We appreciate it, and on to the next one.